I'm Catherine Bowman. I'm a member of the board here, also with the Native Plant Society local chapter. I'm going to go loud, aren't I? Okay, not that. I've known Marc for probably like 20 years now through the Native Plant Society and also through his marvelous books that he has written with his wife, Maria. You will love his talk. I've been to his yard one time, and it's what we all want our yards to look like. It's just like you're in the Princess Bride movie or something magical where there are so many different things flying around to all the plants for pollen and nectar and to lay eggs on the host plants. That's what we all want from our butterfly gardens, isn't it? And from our yards, something that's amazing and wonderful and healthy for our environment. So I'm so happy to be here to introduce Marc, and I will tell you a brief bit of the bio, which I think you may have had an opportunity to read, and that he has a PhD in zoology, and for more than 35 years he's been having professional experience as an interdisciplinary scientist. So I know that he works a lot with specialized pollinators. He's been traveling recently to Cuba to work with some of the scientists there in trying to learn more about South Florida butterflies, which you probably know there's some very rare ones down there. And he's written numerous books and is extremely knowledgeable about pollinators, and I'm sure that with his books on butterflies, he's got a great book on caterpillars, native caterpillars, which is a great ID book. And it looks like he's going to be talking more about bees coming in. I love native bee talk. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Marc Minno.
And you see below here is one of these bees, Eucera longicornis. This is a male. And the scent of the flower mimics the pheromone of the female bee. So he's like overwhelmed by this flower. He comes down and tries to mate with the flower. Okay, and in doing so, he's sticking his head in there and he's getting pollen on his head. And so what an amazing system that this is. This is a famous example. But so we all know red tubular flowers. If you want hummingbirds, plant something like the Lonicera here or the salvia. But butterflies also like red tubular flowers because they have a lot of nectar. And unlike most insects, butterflies can see into the red area of the spectrum. You know, if you put a red porch light on your back porch, moths are not as attracted to that because they can't see it into the red range. They see more into the purple ultraviolet range. They see colors we can't see with our eyes. But butterflies, many butterflies like red flowers. Now you can imagine the bewildering array of flower types that are out there. Here's just some examples of some of our native flowers. And it must be kind of confusing for a pollinator, you know. Well, you know, your tongue is only so long. You can only, you know, get the nectar out of some of these, and where do you go? Which ones do you go to? You know, how do you know which ones have nectar and which ones don't? That's a good question. Well, look at the size range. These are Florida plants. So things like this watermeal plant, which is 1.5 millimeters. The whole plant is 1.5 millimeters. It's a flowering plant. I don't know if there's an insect or something that pollinates it, but somehow it gets pollinated. That tiny, teeny, tiny flower. It's one of the smallest plants in the world. But we also have southern magnolia with, you know, a flower this big. And those at least are pollinated by beetles. So tremendous size range available to pollinators. Let's consider these two cactuses for a minute. And this one on the left, this is our common prickly pear cactus you would see out in dry, sandy areas around Orlando or all through peninsular Florida, really. And so When you see here the petals and the sepals, in this case, they're colored the same. They all look the same. We call those tepals. You have sepals, petals, but these are called tepals. So the petals are attracting, they're the landing platform for pollinators. They're also very colorful, so they're advertising that the flower is open, ready for something to come in there. And then we see in this an abundance of the male part of the flower. These are all the stamens that bear the anthers at the tip that have the pollen in it. And then at the very middle, you see the female part of the flower. This is the pistil with the sticky tip, which is where the pollen has to go. This is the sticky tip, the stigma. So somehow the pollen has to come from here and get on the stigma. But plants, they don't like to self-fertilize because that limits the variation. They want a lot of variation because who knows what the environment's going to be like in a few years. And variation is good for everything. People, dogs, cats, look at all the variation there. So plants want variation too. And so rather than self-pollinating, they really want pollen from another plant somewhere nearby, which is a different genetic type. And so this flower, though, this is a big flower. It's open for business. And one problem with this flower is anything can go in there, right? And they do. I've seen butterflies, beetles, flies. They're little tiny fruit beetles that have their whole life cycle in there, and Drosophila flies have their whole life cycle in there. And so some of these tiny things, they're not doing anything for the plant. The plant's just wasting all of that effort in producing nectar and pollen on these tiny little guys that are robbing. It's basically robbing the plant, and the plant's not getting any benefit out of it. So, but it works. They get enough of the big pollinators in here that it works for the plant, and they have an abundance of nectar. It doesn't really care whether it's being robbed or not, I think. But take a look at this. This is the nopal cactus. If you go to a Mexican restaurant, you can have nopalitos or something like that with the cactus pads. This is a spineless one used in cooking. But basically, you have all the same parts, but by a simple change of closing around the reproductive parts and exerting the reproductive parts, we've now changed it from anybody can come in there to a very exclusive flower meant for hummingbirds. That's a hummingbird flower now. And it's from Central America where there are lots of hummingbirds. So just a simple change, a simple rearrangement has totally changed the pollination of these plants. Let's just look at some architecture of different flowers. And this poppy here, this white prickly poppy, this is kind of a textbook example of a simple flower, and we talked about this. You have the petals acting as a landing platform. You have the male reproductive parts and the female in the center. But again, anything can come in there and take the nectar, pollen, and maybe not do anything for the flower. But there's some other rearrangements of these, like in the carrot family. The flowers are like this, but they're tiny, and they're arranged in these flat heads, dozens, maybe hundreds of them in a flat head. That's called an umbel. And the carrot family plants used to be called umbellifera, the umbel bearers. So you probably, if you've had carrots or something in your garden, you see the same arrangement. And so this has changed it then from this giant flower to many small ones where, and it's a flat surface. So flies and bees can come on there and walk around and just rub the pollen and all over those flowers, is that design. Then there's the composites, and you've heard of this, the aster family plants, many different kinds. It's one of the richest, most biodiverse families of plants. And they're called composites because, like on this beggar tick's flower, this is not one flower. This is a whole head of flowers. And the flowers are of two types. So you see interior are, each one of these is a single flower inside here on the disc. And outside, these are also flowers. These are ray flowers versus disc flowers. They act like petals. So everything in this family is like that, but there's some differences, like over here in the blue mist flower, they're missing the ray flowers around the outside edge. So basically, this one flower, it was like a big stalk of flowers that got compacted and compressed into one structure that looks like one flower. So these are the composites. It's a composite of flowers. Here's another family you're quite familiar with, the bean pea family. Normally, we see these kinds of flowers if you grow beans or peas, this big lip here. And these are perfect for bees. They have to stick their head inside of here, kind of pull this apart, stick their head in to get to the reward for them. But then we also have the powder puff type things, which could be shrubs or ground covers. You've all seen the powder puffs. It looks completely different. I mean, how can these be in the same family? But when they go to seed, they both form pods that look like bean pods. And so the flowers are just, they're attracting different kinds of pollinators, and they've diverged, even within the same family, they've diverged into two different lines. Well, one way to restrict pollinators is to make a tube. So when you have a tube or a funnel, the pollinator has to have a tongue or some way to get to the bottom of the flower to get to the nectar. If you're familiar with these swamp lily crinum flowers, and there are many exotic examples you probably have planted here of crinums, it's got a long tube, maybe this long. So it's a white flower with a long tube, and that usually means it's pollinated by a night-flying moth, the hawk moths. This family of moths, they can be big. In fact, our biggest moth in Florida is one of these hawk moths. It's about this big across in South Florida. And the tongues are huge also, as long or longer than the body, to get to deep-throated flowers such as this. The morning glories are like that, but they're funnel-shaped. So butterflies come to morning glories, and large bees with long tongues go to morning glories. But there's some cheaters out there, right? So if you look at morning glory flowers, you'll see sometimes ones that have a hole chewed in the side. This is where the bees that couldn't reach the nectar by going down the flower decided, well, I'll just chew a hole in the side and get to the nectar anyway. So they've overcome the plant mechanism to select pollinators. And they don't do anything for the plant. They're robbing the nectar, basically. We have lots of different morning glories in Florida, beautiful examples. Most of them are like the tie vine here. They bloom in the morning and they start to wilt and fade towards lunchtime, like us. We're all fading here. But there's the red flowered ones. These tend to be open and available to things like bees all day long. And then we even have some night blooming ones, like this Ipomea macrorrhiza, or the white flowered moonflowers. Those open at dusk and again are probably pollinated by these large hawk moths. The mint family, amazing design, tubular flowers, and as you can see, the reproductive parts are way out here, but there's a lip. Like in the orchids, there's a lip, and the lips often have markings which help guide the pollinators. These are like lights on a runway guiding. Okay, you land here, and you put your head in here, and when they do that, the petal is depressed a little bit, and the pollen gets dusted onto the back of the bee as it's sitting on the lip. And this is the female part here. So when it goes to the next one, some of the pollen will rub off on this stigma and pollinate the plant. They're really amazing mechanical devices to ensure pollination. Back to the cactus flower, I didn't mention earlier, if you see an open cactus flower, take a look at this, because all of these anthers move. And normally a big bee comes in and starts kind of buzzing around in here, and those anthers before your eyes will close up like this around, make a tight ball around the middle of the flower. And when the bee pops out of there, it's just coated with pollen. And then the anthers will relax again, waiting for the next bee. You can do this just with your finger. You can just rub it around like that, and you'll see before your eyes the anthers, closing down around the center of the flower. So flowers with moving parts. We have some stinky flowers out there. The pawpaws are all blooming right now. I drove through Ocala National Forest. The big flowered pawpaw is just gorgeous there right now. But some of the pawpaws we have are red flowered, and they have a fetid smell. And these are attracting flies. The fetid smell and the red flowers look like decaying meat. Okay, so they're attracting these tiny little flies as their pollinators. But we also have, in fact, most of our pawpaws are white flowered and fragrant. And these are ones that are attracting beetles, like the scarab beetle here, which come and eat the petals and rub the pollen around and get the pollen where it needs to go. So these flowers are meant to be eaten by beetles. Then we have the really complex flowers, the orchids, and milkweeds are similar to this. Both of these have the pollen, as you see up here. It's got a sticky base and a stalk to it and two forks. And when the bee comes, it lands on the lip, sticks its head in, and the pollen gets glued to its head on this long stalk. And then when it goes to the next flower, those two lobes go right into the stigma, right where it needs to go to pollinate. And the milkweeds are similar, but on this one, these are kind of complicated. They're covered by a hood, and the wasps and bees are kind of bumbling over here, trying to figure out where's the nectar, and they'll slip their leg up through this slot, and the pollinia will be glued to their leg. And I've seen bees with dozens of milkweed pollinia glued to their legs. Milkweeds in general are very attractive to all kinds of pollinators. Then there's some trap flowers out there, and if you have a pipe vine in your butterfly garden, this is one of our native ones, woolly pipe vine. Like the stinky flowers, it's got a fetid odor, and it looks like rotting meat, and it attracts little flies that come in, and it's like a pitcher plant at this point. There are lots of little hairs inside this tube that goes down into this bulbous base. This is where the flower parts are. They're hidden down here. And so the flies come in, but they can't get out because the hairs are pointing the wrong way. And they get trapped back in here, and they're like, woohoo! There's all this food for us in here. And they have big parties in there, and they have a great time. And then the next day, the flower wilts a little bit, and those hairs flatten out, and it releases all the flies that now have pollen on them, and they go, of course, to the next flower over and have a big party in there. So that's the pollination syndrome of that. The water lilies are a little bit different. This flower takes 2 days. The first day it opens, the male part of the flower is not active, only the female part. And it's a disc down in the middle, covered by a little bit of water. And the flies and bees, whatever insects come in there to get something, and they end up drowning in the water. And chances are some of those were at a flower that had the male parts active. And so the pollen grains sink to the bottom and pollinate the plant. That's the first day, the murder, the slaughter of innocent pollinators. The flower closes overnight. The next day it opens, but the female part is dried up and the male part is active now. So the pollen's being released. And so it's a kind of a deadly trap for pollinators. The arum family, this includes your philodendrons, your pothos, your jack-in-the-pulpits, all kinds of house plants that we grow are in the arum family. Elephant ears, taro, all those are in the arum family. And they have this kind of arrangement where their flower parts are covered by a hood. In the case of jack-in-the-pulpit, it's kind of a funnel or a tube with the female parts of the flowers hidden way inside and the male parts sticking up. So in the case of jack-in-the-pulpit, they come in and they kind of get trapped in here for a little bit to get the pollen. And but in many of these other ones, there's a tight hood around the female part. So you see, I've torn open this one. I've torn open this, so you see the male flower part up on top there, and it's exposed, so they can come and get pollen, get covered with pollen. But then they have to squeeze down through this covering to get to the nectar part, and that's where the female flowers are. And so most of those have this arrangement. And not only do they have these hidden parts or these regions of male and female, but they're famous for producing heat. So if you're from up north, you may be familiar with skunk cabbage. This is a plant in the arum family that blooms early spring. It can melt out of the snow because it produces metabolic heat from the plant itself is growing and producing heat. So if you have one of the philodendrons or elephant ears in your yard, go out at dusk and feel that column, and it'll feel warm to the touch. That heat helps disperse the scent of the flower and attract pollinators. I don't know of any other plants that produce heat. There's a famous example of yucca plants, and they should be blooming real soon if they're not already blooming. And they're pollinated only by tiny white moths, like this one. You see that? This was at the Archbold Biological Station. So if you see a blooming yucca, you can open those flowers, and chances are in one of them you'll see one of these white moths. The moth is specially adapted. Its mouth parts are specially shaped to gather pollen from the yucca plant when the flowers are open. It then goes to the female part of the yucca plant and puts the pollen where it needs to go. So it's actively pollinating the plant. Then it lays its eggs there, and when the eggs hatch, the larvae eat the developing seeds of the yucca. So the moth is ensuring that her children will have something to eat by pollinating the plant. But the larvae usually don't eat all of the seeds, so the plant gets some benefit also in that it's ensured this moth is going to make sure that it gets pollinated. And so that's the relationship there. Well, let's look at some different groups of pollinators and see what they're doing. In general, butterflies, butterflies are pollinators, but in general, they kind of suck at pollinating. That's a pun. Okay, so if we look at this Gulf fritillary, here it is on this bidens, and you see it's standing way away with its long legs. Well, maybe the legs are getting some pollen, maybe the tip of the proboscis, so it's doing something. But there's a famous example on our wonderful zebra heliconian, our state butterfly. You probably all have this in your yard, right? The zebra heliconian. It does so many interesting things. Have you seen them sleep together at night in a big cluster? Sometimes hundreds of them in one cluster at night. always in the same place every night for months. Well, that's part of the problem for the zebra heliconian because it's one of our longest lived butterflies. It lives for maybe at least 3 months as an adult. And, you know, over that time, it's laying eggs. The females are laying their eggs, and you can't possibly store enough nutrients as a caterpillar to last months and months. You know, they need protein. They need nutrients to go into those eggs. So where do you get protein? You get it from pollen. So the females, I think only the females do this. They go to plants that have a lot of pollen, and you see it's collected a whole wad of pollen on its proboscis. Then it spits on it, and it lets it sit and digest externally, and then it slurps it up, and that's the pollen that she needs to develop her eggs over months of time. Isn't that amazing? There's another interesting pollination with butterflies. Here's one I took in Cuba, and you see these swallowtails are covered with pollen underneath. And here's one from Miami. Look, it's just, the person that sent this to me thought it was moldy or something, it had some fungal disease, but that's pollen. And I think it's from the Royal Poinciana tree. Swallowtails, when they're feeding at a flower, they're constantly fluttering their wings. They don't like it to come and sit. They're constantly on the move like this. And the wings underneath are getting dusted with that sticky pollen. And if you go to enough flowers, it really builds up. And so you can see how amazing that is on these swallowtail butterflies. I think other butterflies do it too, but especially on the swallowtails. Well, butterflies aren't the only visitors to flowers. If you look at your flowers, you'll see a lot of wasps coming to the flowers, and the wasps are just amazing, really. There's so many different kinds. They're not likely to sting you, you know, they're busy getting their food from the flower. You can go up, you can look at them. Some of them are very quick, they're hard to photograph. You know, they'll be there for just a few seconds and then they're off to another flower and you're like, okay. But if you're patient, you can get pictures of them. And there's so many different kinds. This is just some examples here. Actually, this one is an introduction from South America. The University of Florida tested this and brought this in as a mole cricket parasite. So the adults hunt mole crickets to lay their eggs on, and the wasp larva destroys mole crickets then. But it's very common at flowers. I also like the bee wolf up there. There's several different species of this. And even though it's kind of a small wasp, they hunt flies and other insects that are coming to flowers to stock their nests with. So this is the bee wolf part of it. They're pouncing on other things, even much bigger insects, and carrying them off to their nest. And these thin-head wasps, these are quite common. They're unusual because they have a little hook like this at the tip of their abdomen, and they parasitize scarab beetles that are in your lawn in other places. So they're performing, you know, biological control services as their life cycle. These scoliid wasps are really nice. Some of them are quite large, beautifully colored. There's one that's black and red with yellow spots. This is one of the most common ones, the feather-legged one. You'll also see a lot of spider wasps. They come in various colors too. They're usually very excited. They're constantly moving around. And then the digger wasps, the sphecids, the thread-waisted wasps. These guys, this family, they have a very narrow waist. You see this? This is all the abdomen, and then it thickens out here. I don't know how they do this, really. I mean, because their digestive system, their circulation system, everything has to go through that tiny little waist. And how do they even fit it in there? I'm not sure how they do that or why they have it like that, but they do. So the digger wasp, you may see these just in your yard if there's a sandy patch. They nest in the ground, and it's a quite large wasp. It's about this big. I've seen sometimes in the Keys areas where there's hundreds of them. And you're like, oh my God, what are all these bees? But there are these digger wasps digging their nests. They're not social, but they like to nest together in groups. And the Mexican grass-carrying wasp, it cuts pieces of grass to line its nest with. So sometimes you see them carrying a piece of grass and flying around with it. Of course, we have other kinds of wasps, like the paper wasps. You're all familiar with paper wasps. Like many of these wasps, they're feeding their larvae other insects. So paper wasps are tremendous at biological control. They're kind of a bane of butterfly gardeners because once they find a plant with a caterpillar, it could be monarch caterpillars, it could be zebra caterpillar, whatever, they'll come back and take every one of them. And they chew them up and feed their babies this protein-rich mixture in their nest. So they're great at biological control, but the adults feed on nectar, so they're coming to flowers for their nectar. There's also other wasps, these potter wasps. You may have seen these. They make little clay pots around your windowsills maybe, or up under your eaves of your house sometimes. And they stock those with spiders or caterpillars and lay their eggs inside the pot. You know, we have flies out there too that come to flowers. And some of them are specifically flower flies. Now, they look like bees, and they gain protection from predators by looking like bees because, you know, bees sting. Well, I look like a bee, so probably the birds aren't going to mess with me. And so what look like bees there are actually flies. Flies are the group of insects, they only have 2 wings, right? One pair of wings instead of 4 that wasps or butterflies have. The love bugs, they'll be coming out soon. You're all familiar with love bugs. The adults love to come to flowers, especially flowers, you know, our tropical flowers here, it has not only nectar in there, but there are also things called pyrrolizidine alkaloids. We drink alkaloids in our coffee, you know, and plant alkaloids are very common in many different kinds of plants. And it can go into the nectar also as an attractant for certain pollinators. And so things like these love bugs are coming not only to get the nectar, but also to suck up those alkaloids, which they use for their own protection. You see they're black and orange. Those are warning colors. And this is one reason they're so docile. You know, they're just lazily flying around. I don't care if there's a bird there. Come and get me, birds. You know, and if a bird tries to grab one of those, it spits it out immediately because they taste so bad, partly from those alkaloids. Okay, so the alkaloids are protecting the love bugs. I don't know about down here, but up north from Gainesville, there's a myth in North Florida that the University of Florida brought in love bugs from Texas and released them as some kind of a biological control project. And that's totally wrong. That's not true at all. But people like to blame it on the University of Florida. There's so many clouds of them coming out now. There's also a lot of different kinds of beetles that come to flowers. Things like these longhorn beetles or cerambycids, amazing. Blister beetles, there's a couple of these that really like flowers. Blister beetles, because if you pick them up, they'll bleed a liquid that will cause blisters on your skin. So you don't really want to handle those too much. The metallic wood-boring beetles are beautiful, and they often come. And then these tiny little beetles, the tumbling flower beetles, very small, black or gray. You'll see many of them often on aster family plants. And if you get too close, they just tumble off. So that's where their name comes from. Okay, so we looked at those other groups, but it's really bees. Bees are they get the job done, right? They can move the pollen like nothing else can move pollen and get to the flowers. In fact, things like bumblebees, they actually sleep out on flowers at night to make sure they're the first ones there at dawn to get the most nectar out of those flowers. there's a big competition as the day goes on, you know, between butterflies and all these other things, beetles, flies. I've seen butterflies trying to get nectar, and a bee will come and knock it off of there. You know, it'll dive bomb it to get it away. And they're all doing that. They're all kind of jostling each other for those flowers. A lot of competition. So these are some of our largest bees, the carpenter bees. Often they look like bumblebees, but they're shiny on the rear end, right? The carpenter bees. Bumblebees are covered with hairs and look dull, not shiny. The carpenter bees bore into dead wood, but they're happy to bore into your house or barn or sheds if it's not painted especially. They can bite holes to make their nests in the wood. So that's why they're carpenter bees. Many different kinds of bumblebees. Those are probably our largest. We have maybe, I don't know, a dozen different kinds of bumblebees in Florida. And honeybees. You're all familiar with honeybees. Not native to North America. They came from Europe many, many years ago. When people first came over here, they brought honeybees with them, and they spread everywhere. To tell you the truth, I don't know what we would do without honeybees, because they go to every kind of flower you can imagine. They're real workhorses. And with the decline of native pollinators like we've seen, honeybees get the job done. To the point where, you know, they import bees to squash fields, or used to be for orange groves. They bring in bees from all over the place to help pollinate those crops and make sure they got a lot of fruit from them. And they still do that. I should mention too, you've heard of Africanized bees. Okay, so mostly we have the European type of honeybee, which can be aggressive, but they're not as aggressive as the African strain of the honeybee. And those guys, you know, if you disturb their nest, they all come out to get you. And there are cases of people being stung to death by Africanized bees. So long ago, I don't know, maybe 100 years ago now, somebody thought they would import African bees into Brazil to cross it with European bees there, because the African bees are tropical and they're really productive. And so they thought, well, we'll cross these and have our own strain that's not so aggressive, but they still are really good at getting honey done. And unfortunately, they escaped, of course, and these Africanized bees got loose, first in Brazil, then they spread all over Central America. And you may remember in the 60s or 70s, there used to be newspaper stories, you know, killer bees are coming, killer bees are near Texas, well, we have killer bees now. Killer bees are in Florida. They find nests of those all the time. You can't really tell by looking at them. They have to do like a genetic test to actually tell. But if you see a colony of bees that's especially aggressive, it's probably an Africanized colony. But you won't hear anything about killer bees in the press anymore. They're all called African bees because it scares people, right? And it is kind of a scary thing. So you don't want to drive away all the tourists from Florida by saying we have killer bees here. So now they're African bees, but they're here too. We have other things like these beautiful orchid bees. They're probably in the garden here now. They've spread all over Florida. They came in about 2000 from Central America somehow, and beautiful little green bees. And you see some other ones. The squash bees are famous for pollinating squashes. So if you have a garden where you grow squashes every year, you may have those. If you just grow squash occasionally, probably not. And honeybees do the pollination. The sweat bees, these are kind of small, but they're often beautifully colored. And leafcutter bees, these are very common, many different kinds. And you'll notice those long hairs underneath the abdomen there, those are the ones that they gather the pollen on. So as they're walking over, their legs are kind of brushing all the pollen onto these hairs that they take back to their nest to feed their larvae. And they're called leafcutter bees because they cut pieces of leaf such as from this willow leaf or bean leaves or many different kinds of leaves they'll pick and cut these oval or circular shapes to line their nests with. Have you seen those shapes? They're out there if you look. And the bees are there, very common group of bees. So, just some different kinds of flowers that I've seen in my garden. In fact, most of those photos I took in my garden, you know. So, when I started looking at bees and flies, it's like, holy cow, there's a lot of different diversity here I never even thought was here. And, but these are particularly good for attracting things like bees and butterflies. So the beggar ticks, these are all native plants too. The bee balm and the snow square stem are top in my yard. But other things like these trees, the hawthorns can be really good in the springtime, and the buckthorns and that hog plum too is just, it's covered with pollinators when it's in bloom. That's the story of the pollinators. We can have questions now. I just wanted to point out I do tropical trips. We're going to Cuba in July and again next February, but also Colombia in September, October of this year. If you're interested, give me your email address and I'll send you some information. And don't forget, there's a free poster up here if you want. Okay, any questions? Wow, you're stunned. Yes, ma'am.
I'm not sure this is for you to answer, but I've been told to cut down like the milkweed once a year because of the parasite OE.
Yes. Oh my gosh. Well, there's a guy from University of Georgia who's on a campaign to wipe out OE in Florida. I forget his name now, but he's been sending around an open letter saying, get rid of all of your exotic milkweeds from gardens. Get rid of, just don't cut it, just get rid of it. And he thinks that's going to cure, but it won't. He's crazy, because it's not. There are wild milkweeds out there, and there are wild monarchs out there, so they're still there. If you get them out of your garden, you won't have any monarchs, right? And as he says in his letter, Florida monarchs have never been in decline. In fact, they've been increasing, even though they're heavily parasitized by that parasite. So I think they're living with it. In my own opinion, this is natural selection, right, going on. The weaker monarchs are going to die out that have the parasite. The stronger ones are going to survive and reproduce, and we'll come up with a monarch that's resistant to the OE, I think is what's happening. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
I had a friend tell me just the other day that there were milkweed plants that weren't fully mature, that had flowers, and the butterflies would go and feed. And there was something in the not fully formed milkweed.
Okay.
Pardon I'm new at this.
Yeah.
Anyway, the butterfly would like spasm and then die.
Wow. Well, some of those milkweeds, you know, they're sprayed in the nurseries. Many of the nurseries that they have spray them with insecticides to kill any things like that, because they want to sell a plant, right? If it's all chewed up, they're not going to be able to sell it. And they're also spraying for the yellow aphids to get on them. And so that may have been a case where that one was sprayed and it just ate a little bit and then died. Some of those insecticides are really, really powerful.
Well, I had just gotten some more milkweed plants, and I thought,
Yeah.
well, what am I going to do? Put these under a net and let them get mature and then put them out?
You might have to wait, but some of those insecticides are pretty persistent. So if you can find a source where you know that they haven't been sprayed, that would be ideal. Or from a friend that has extra plants maybe too.
Right.
You know, that's probably the way to go.
Okay.
Yes. Well, thank you so much for coming today. It's been a beautiful day.